Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sit through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler, and today we're talking about
Rhetoric and beyond, and this is a little bit of a reprise of an episode that we did 2 shows back, because we took a little bit of a, what would you call it, discursus into interviewing Carneades about skepticism, who we'll hopefully have on again some other time to talk about that. We talked about his recent book, right?
Right.
And now we're coming back to delving into rhetoric, but we're gonna go beyond it. We're gonna talk about what else there is besides rhetoric. And what else did you have in mind for this, Dan?
So if the main point of rhetoric is that we are trying to convince someone to believe or hold an opinion, then there is the standard model that we talked about last week with Aristotle laying out the logos, ethos, and pathos as main ways of making speech in order to try to convince someone one way or the other. But there are other ways to have conversations and to actually change people's minds without directly attacking these ideas in the way that these 3 major ways tend to do. And you can maybe say that they're a little bit of one thing or other, but they're all taking kind of a circuitous route to getting at this thing without going directly at the thing.
Okay.
But if the end result is to actually change someone's mind, then it doesn't matter the route that you get there, it's the one that is actually the most effective.
Yeah, and there's a lot of ways of changing any given person's mind on the one hand. And I think on the other hand, we can also say that there are some people where, for better or for worse, it's very, very, very difficult to get them to change their mind. They're not amenable to persuasion or conviction or rational argumentation or things like that. I mean, a prime example of this, which doesn't completely fit this, are the people who are unconvinced of something until it happens to them or somebody that they care about or relate to. Like you think about COVID, right? For quite a while, there were people that were denying important aspects or facts or things we could say about COVID that the educated populace more or less was willing to buy into without being epidemiologists themselves. And they were, oh no, it's, none of this mask stuff is important. Vaccines are bad for you, blah, 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 blah. And then suddenly they got COVID and they changed their tune, or they saw their kid or their parent or spouse getting sick and going to the hospital, and suddenly they cared about it in a way that they didn't before. So I think there's a lot of people probably like that, not just with that particular thing, where until it hits home with them or there's a story that they can relate to, it doesn't do that much for them. It's kind of like, somebody else's problem.
And it absolutely is this idea of relating to things. And this is actually one of the things that we'll get into later, is a way to talk to someone that might be totally outside of your group and still be able to relate to them in a way that allows them to potentially see your story as a valid one.
Something that they could take into their little universe.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Also, just as a short reprise, what we were asking last week was, what is rhetoric, good or bad? And it really comes down to the way that you're using it and for what ends you're trying to get to. And so this is also going to carry on for all of these particular techniques, is what are you trying to do with it? Are these for good ends or are they bad ends?
I think that the ends thing is completely correct. But I think we could also talk to some degree about means. You could have a good end. Let's say you just want people to like each other and not be mean to each other or something like that. That's a pretty good end. I mean, there's some people maybe that we should be mean to, but let's put that aside for a moment, right? But you could try to use very coercive or manipulative or deceptive means to get them to do that. Like, and it doesn't have to be all that terrible. You could like tell them some story that's completely false about somebody who was bullied and ostracized and try to make them feel bad. And this is a completely made up story, but you present it as if it's true. I would say that even though there's a good end in sight, maybe the means, it doesn't turn the end bad, right? The end still remains good, but you do have to watch the means that you're using. And I think with rhetoric, we have to be pretty careful. So like maybe we have to check in every so often to see whether we're lying to ourselves about whether we're being overly manipulative or straying over certain lines. I mean, what do you think about that means end distinction thing there?
Well, I think that comes down to a lot of the types of rhetoric we see today. And especially we just completed another election season, and we had a whole bunch of rhetoric on the TV and the radio and on the internet, everywhere you went. And a lot of it is using our pathos, specifically fear. The question is, how much are you willing to demonize another person in order to win your race? Or how much are you willing to use people's bigotry and prejudices in order to, put forward or advance your candidate? What are the things that you'll pay, to actually get that power?
Yeah, and sometimes this can be verbal. And in other cases, it can be visual, like I think we're all familiar in commercials. There can be sound aspects too, right? So they'll have it's in color, the candidate that you're running against, and they're like, I don't know, cuddling a puppy or, tussling some child's hair or something like that. And it's almost like there used to be this show called Tales from the Dark Side back in the 1980s. And it began with this guy talking, and it was kind of like an idyllic scene, countryside, and I forget exactly the wording. You can look it up on YouTube. It's a really great intro sequence. This guy's talking about, most of us live in the sunlit world of what we take to be reality. And then suddenly everything starts turning darker. And it's not like negative, where all the colors become exactly the opposite, but and I don't know how they did this special effect, but it must have been like a really advanced thing back then. Now we would just, type in a few things on our video editing software. But, like the scene turns dark and the music gets kind of warped and scary sounding. And then the announcer, who's got this deep voice, is like, but there is also a dark side unbeknownst to most of us, and it's just as real, but not as brightly lit, right? And instead what they do with these candidates are they're like, well, Mandela Barnes looks like a really good guy, but, and now it turns to like black and white and like the image skews a little bit and the music comes in, he kicks puppies, throws them down the well, or they do this with, whoever else, right? It's kind of, you almost know exactly what's going to happen when you see the first intro frames because it's such a common technique. And it's there specifically, like you were saying, it's appealing to pathos, which means emotion, and the emotion that it's appealing to. If it's not fear, it's usually another negative emotion like disgust or anger, or I suppose you could say envy in some cases. It's usually not like, let's appeal to happiness,
I guess I'm going to quote Yoda here. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, hate leads to suffering. Which is interesting.
Yeah.
I feel like it could get fleshed out if you actually wanted to use this as like a full thing. But it's a good like stepping off point of like, yeah, you're using this pathos, fear and anger, which leads you to like want to do anything to stop this person.
Yeah.
And that's a strong motivator. And so this is actually, one of the reasons that this is actually a really bad technique to use in order to actually persuade someone that's not already on your side. It's much more useful to take a person who already agrees with you and rile them up in order to actually get them out to vote. And so a lot of the campaigns are moving towards the electorate's so split, and very closely so, that it's not about persuasion. It's just, get as many of your voters to the polls versus the other.
Yeah. And, I'll say two things. One is, I think you're right about that. The polarization, as we typically call it, has changed the scene in American politics, certainly, especially here in Wisconsin, where the margins are so thin, right? And a lot of times it's not just the candidate who's being attacked, it's the other side's voters. Don't let those people control things. You better get out there and vote, because otherwise they're going to, get what they want. So there's that. And I think the Yoda quote is actually, I don't know about the suffering part. I think maybe that comes in at every single point, but fear does lead to anger pretty predictably. So you make people scared with your rhetorical appeal, and people don't like to be scared. So then they much prefer to be angry, because anger feels like an emotion that has,
can hold on to and use.
Yeah, it's got agency, right? It's more active, whereas fear, you're pushing yourself back. And a lot of people are very invested in feeling like they're not fear-driven. That was another thing with the COVID. Oh, I'm not going to put on a mask and give in to fear, and you're like, you're afraid of putting on a mask. Who are you trying to fool, But then, another interesting thing is anger does lead to hate. And this is something that gets noted by a lot of different thinkers, including Aristotle. Aristotle in the Rhetoric says one of the causes for hate, which is qualitatively distinct from anger, is anger. If you feel angry at somebody over and over and over again, there's a tendency to veer over into this other modality of emotion. And, anger doesn't want to completely destroy the person it's angry at. Hate, Aristotle tells us, this is way back in 2300, plus BC, he tells us that hate ultimately wants the object of hate not to exist. So hate wants to efface and wipe out the thing that's hated. Yeah, exactly. So, to annihilate, you could say.
Yeah. And you brought up a couple of other things that are also on my list here, which is the in-group versus out-group, which is a very strong pathos-based reasoning. And then the other ones that I put down here are the optimism. We saw that really well done with the Obama campaign, the whole "Yes, we can." It was incredibly optimistic of those things that
the appeal to hope.
Yeah. And so the policy was a little bit thin there. It was a lot of just hope and change, and what does that actually mean? And then the other one that I saw a lot this year was shame, and there's a lot of things that were trying to get people to go out to the polls, and it says your vote is secret, but if you went and voted, is public record. Will your friends and family and neighbors think better of you if you don't go vote? So there's another pathos type argument.
One, yeah.
Actually, it works. People really dislike it, but it actually works. That's why people do it.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that there are a lot of ethos-based appeals, but they tend to be false. So ethos means character, right? Mm-hmm. And Aristotle says, well, you should try to present yourself as being a certain kind of person so the audience will believe you. And he actually names off three qualities. I don't see this as an exclusive or comprehensive list, but he says, if you want to be believed to be acting in good faith, an interlocutor that could be listened to, you need to you need to look like you possess. You don't actually have to have it, but you need to have something that looks like virtue, right? So you need to look like you're a decent person in some respect. You need to look like you have what the Greeks called phronesis, or practical wisdom or prudence. So you're not a dummy, right? If you're going to make policy proposals, you actually know what the hell you're talking about. your proposals aren't stupid. You take into account new factors. But then he also says that you need to have what the Greeks called eunoia, which means goodwill. So you need to at least appear like somebody who cares about the people they're talking to. And this is where like Barack Obama and Bill Clinton were really good at that sort of thing. You notice like Hillary Clinton, very, very smart. And actually looks like, she was a pretty decent person, but she didn't have that part down. People didn't trust her,
the question is, how much of that was her and how much was that of 20 years of negative rhetoric against her?
Yeah. Well, and so, ethos is not something that you can yourself completely control. Mm-hmm. And I kind of think that most of the appeals in politics about ethos are at best like half-truths, I mean, they're always like, oh, so-and-so is a successful businessman. And you're like, well, let's actually look into this. What happened in their business? Oh, there were like sexual harassment suits and they overcharged the state for things. Anybody who has done their research knows which candidate I'm talking about here. Mm-hmm. One of those who lost this time around, right? But I mean, what's being presented there is like, something that sounds really good, successful business person, or it could be, person of faith, or it could be, what are some other ones?
A military veteran.
Oh, that's a huge one, right? Yeah. I mean, anybody who's been in the military, I think if they're smart, they don't automatically trust veterans because they're like, I remember the stupid, terrible people that I served with, some of whom, there were some really great people that I served with, and then there were people that I would not trust with a penny,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
go ahead.
I just trying to continue on just a little bit, with the what the other rhetorics that we have currently. There's almost no logos, at least in the last couple of years. There's not a lot of policy positions that are putting out here. It's not saying like, "Hey, vote for me. I'm going to do this." It's been very much overwhelmingly negative. Just like the other party bad. Don't vote for them. Vote for us.
Or the policy positions that are being put out are primarily there to appeal to emotion, and they're not like real policy proposals, very complex, covering all the bases, making a good case for what they want to do. Or, I mean, I take that back. I would say that the Democrats actually often do bring that stuff out, and then everybody's bored by it. And they don't get super excited, Right. Whereas the Republicans, they'll bring out a policy and it'll be some, think about the Don't Say Gay bill, down in Florida, right? Very straightforward. You're not going to be allowed to talk about homosexuality or any LGBTQ stuff. I mean, there's an argument there. It's pretty much a bad argument based on premises that are very doubtful. But and it's functioning less as like an argument and more like an emotional appeal,
Yeah, it's won't somebody think of the children?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's using not just an emotional appeal, but a trope.
Yeah.
Something that got made fun of by The Simpsons like 20 years ago.
That is exactly what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
What's the pastor's wife? Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But they also will use policy as an attack. It's like, oh, my opponent will do X, Y, and Z, or take away your rights, let the criminals out, tax you to death.
Right.
Which are like proposals, but they're like negative proposals, and so it's this very odd twisting of don't vote for me because I have proposals that you'll like. It's don't vote for them because those have those dangerous proposals that we've told you are bad.
And something that is often left out of that, and it's good that we exist in a culture where we can actually track the things down. So, people were going after Governor Evers in this last race about, he's too soft on crime. He's letting these people out on, I forget if it's like furlough or parole or something like that. And then other people pointed out, well, under the Walker administration, which Evers, ran against and defeated Scott Walker, there were even more people like this. So if you're complaining about this, but you didn't complain about that, what's up with that? And it's sort of I guess you could say it's pointing out a fallacy that we could call hypocrisy or selective memory, But there is an awful lot of that in political rhetoric. And I think we could say there's a lot of that in other types of rhetoric too, right? When, we're constantly being pitched products, right?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, like it's not like buy this car because this car has great mileage and it'll be safe for your family. Volvo, I guess,
that's boring stuff.
Yeah. It's like, buy this car and like all the women will like you and like dogs will like, I don't know, turn their head and there's all sorts of like it's cool by association a lot of the time. It's like, just get like really, really famous people and they drive your thing. It's like, I want to be like Drake and Drake drives that. So I want that. Or Drake wears those shoes.
What car manufacturer really has tapped into both Pathos and Ethos is Subaru.
Yeah.
They've got those ad campaigns where like, to begin with, you're going to have your Subaru forever. So there's that part. And I guess that's kind of a logical appeal, but it'll be like, you can pass it down to your kid and you see like the whole vignette, like, so, little kids hopping in the car and then, they're like tweens and then they're teenagers and then they get to drive the car and then dad is handing over the keys to his daughter. She's going off to college or something. There's like an entire story being told there. And that is very successful rhetoric,
Yeah. But this all comes back to certainty or beliefs and why we actually come to them. And so there's a neurologist by the name of Robert Burton who did over a decade worth of research on psychological triggers for why we feel certain about things, because it comes down to we feel the same way or we feel the same certainty when we're correct as when we are incorrect.
Yeah.
There's the confidently incorrect. And so here's a little blurb about some of his work. Certainty, argues Robert Burton, is not a conscious choice, nor a thought process, but is a sensation that can be described as a feeling of knowing. As a feeling like anger or fear, certainty does not rely on any underlying state of knowledge. What this means, Burton argues, is that we can be wrong even when we're convinced we're right. As an example, Burton describes the Challenger study, in which a group of students were told to write down their experiences of feelings right after the Challenger explosion happened, and then asked to come back and recall their thoughts immediately after this 3 years down the road. They were very confident, all of them, about what their feelings were at the time. And then they went back and looked at their diaries of their own handwriting, and a large proportion of them confidently believed that their diaries were wrong and that their memory was the correct recollection of what happened at the time.
Yeah, that is. I actually remember being in the classroom when they wheeled in the TVs and we were watching it, and it was supposed to be like this triumphal moment. I think it was because there was a teacher on board. That's why it was supposed to be such a big deal. And then we're watching it and you see it like start to fall apart and the smoke and we're like, the vast majority of the responses, I think, if I remember back to it, were not like, oh, so horrible, collective grief or anything like that. It was like, what are we watching? What the hell's going on here?
Really? Interesting.
Yeah. But I think that there's a lot of narratives, right? Of, the nation as a whole. Like for my generation, that was supposed to be the JFK assassination moment, seeing the Challenger blow up. But it wasn't. I mean, I think that was basically in like news reporters' heads who wanted to have some sort of interesting analogy to draw,
Yeah.
Now, there's one other thing I was going to say about this, too. I mean, Burton is saying something that philosophers like David Hume have said in the past, that, that this, what we call belief is we think of it as cognitive. I believe that XYZ is the case, but it really is a matter of feeling more than anything else.
Yeah. Was it the passions, or sorry, the intellect is always the slave of the passions? Is that the quote?
He said that reason, and he's overplaying his hand there, because like just a couple lines later, he almost disproves this in the same thing. But Hume was a great rhetorician. I mean, this is a great line. Reason is and can only be the slave of the passions, right? Yeah, he's the guy who coined that good phrase. Hume is a really good writer stylistically, but that doesn't mean that he actually knows. Well, he does know what he's talking about, but he doesn't always present it in the best way. He can't resist sometimes making it sound better than it is. You know.
So this comes down to, if we don't consciously make these decisions about what we believe, or if we even feel certain about the things that we supposedly believe, then what is the best way to potentially change one's mind? If it's not like, I'm going to think about this really strongly and just like, I'll figure this out, or have a good conversation with a good interlocutor, a honest person that you're having a dialogue with, what is the process to actually do this? And well,
I was going to say, if you think about how people rationally approach situations where they're not quite sure and they need to figure something out. So like take the example of buying a car, right? You could do that in a lot of ways. You could just like walk into a dealership and let them exercise their rhetoric on you, and you walk out of there with a car that's probably not good for you. Or you could like get Consumer Reports and like check out all the different stuff, and that's much more logical, right? Sooner or later, you still have to consider things like, well, should we get a minivan? Should we get an SUV? Should we get a 4-door? Depends on what our needs are going to be, and there's a lot of things that maybe, are we going to have 15 kids? Well, then we need a minivan, and maybe a trailer. Are we going to have 2 kids? Maybe we can get by with just a 4-door and car seats or something like that. So there's those kind of rational decisions. Like where are your kids going to go to school? What are you going to major in? These things can be dealt with pretty rationally, right?
Yeah.
And then you have questions like, is my spouse cheating on me or not? Like, I'll bring this up in my class and talk about epistemology, and I'll be like, epistemology can be about very day-to-day things. Like, your spouse comes back from work and their hair's all messed up and their clothes are buttoned up weird. Like, they're not exactly the way they were when they came home, and they kind of smell like somebody's perfume or cologne or something like that, right? And now you're like, wait a second, what the hell's going on here? Now you're like thinking about, wait, didn't I see like a phone call come in and they took it off in the other room? And you start bringing all this stuff together, right? And that can be done in a very rational way, but most people don't. They bring in all sorts of emotions, and you need to have a conclusion soon. You got to figure this out, right? Or it could be anything else. Like, am I going to go to prison for this thing I did? Or, anything that could like bring in our emotions. We're still operating in a semi-rational way, but we're also being driven by our passions.
Right. And so this comes to exactly the next topic here of, what are the things that we are able to actually make rational choices about, and what are the things we're not? And so it's very uncommon to have someone change their mind over even some small things if they're important to them. And it's even more uncommon to have people change their minds on something that's strongly held. And so these are any beliefs that serve as the foundations for their roles in life, and these things that they can't give up without the consequences of an existential crisis. And so some of these things are, what are your ideas of what good and bad are? Is the world just? Beliefs about what is natural for humans. Beliefs about what political party you're for. Your sports team's affiliation, and what religion you believe are true. And all these things, people will build their entire lives around. And if they were to lose these beliefs, they would have to reevaluate everything about, or a lot of what they believed and how they were even going to interact with the world on a day-to-day basis.
I think it's very interesting that you've got the sports teams in there because, most of these things is the world just? Okay, big metaphysical and ethical issues. What's natural for humans, right? Which religion is true? What political party? Those all sound really important, right? And you'd think that sports teams, that's entertainment. That's not that important. But people do get super, super attached to that. I am, and I think I may have mentioned this on the air before, I am both a Packers fan and a Bears fan, which is kind of a rarity in either state of Wisconsin or Illinois. And there's, a whole story that I don't need to rehearse there. Basically, my parents moved up from the Chicagoland area to Wisconsin, like to watch both teams. We had, memorabilia and cups from both teams. And so I just grew up that way, right? But a lot of people are like, you have to pick one, And I'm like, no, I don't have to. I just hate the Vikings instead, I reserve all my hatred for them. But, think about this. When people lose a sports team, right? Because, franchises move from place to place. That's a huge blow. People aren't sure where they should be putting their whatever it is that we have for sports teams into. So when the Colts move from Baltimore to Indianapolis, or when the Rams were moving around, they went from LA and then they were in St. Louis for a long time, and then they went back to
LA.
Did they go straight back to LA? Yeah. Now, who are the St. Louis people supposed to root for? They got to kind of figure out,
Yeah.
Baltimore got the Ravens, so.
Yeah. And then the Browns became something else, and then they got the Browns back, or a new franchise?
The Browns became the new Ravens, I think, right?
Oh, yeah?
And then the Browns became the new Browns.
Right. So, coming back to these beliefs and these things that we really hold dear, we have a lot of neurology science and experiments with we know which portions of the brain light up when we are feeling in physical danger, and these same portions of the brain light up when people make arguments against these deeply held beliefs, because it's this self-preservation portion of the brain, and these ideas are so important that you have now cognitively put them into, I need to defend these things, just as I need to defend my arm from being bit off by a tiger.
Yeah.
And so when you try to use rhetoric to try to change one's minds on things that they hold dear, and you go at them directly, throw more information at them. They just throw up walls, because their information is coming from someone that they perceive as a potential enemy, and two, it's attacking this thing that is foundational. They might
also treat it as if it's kind of trivial. I'm thinking about the religion and the Christian atheist polemics that were really big on social media in the early 2010s, or all this stuff about apologetics. Very few people, I think, are actually convinced by apologetics one way or the other, because it's a logical appeal. And, as soon as somebody is taking the opposite team and starting to produce their arguments, you're there's probably got to be something wrong with this somewhere, right?
Right. You get super skeptical to the point where nothing is going to even make it through your filter.
Yeah.
And
I want to say one other thing.
all right.
I'm always deeply suspicious of people, and I'm a philosopher, right? So I should be all for rational arguments. I'm deeply suspicious of people who wind up being convinced solely by rational argument, or say that they were, and like abandoned faith or took on faith as a result. To me, I always think there's something else going on in the background.
Well, you're very Hume then.
Yeah, I'm Humean in that way.
Yeah. And I guess one of the extra things is that people carry their opinions and their beliefs with them, and so just because people say like, "Oh, just give them the data," it's always being filtered by their own brain, and they have certain different values that you might not hold as strongly as they do, and so they're going to make their decision making from a totally different place. So the question is rhetoric dead? If people hold these strong beliefs and none of the straight up rhetoric can actually break through this barrier for the very strongly held beliefs, is there any point, or is there something else?
Well, what would be doing the job of what rhetoric does, which is to tailor appeals to particular audiences in, pretty thoughtful, sophisticated ways that we can teach people how to do. I mean, we do this in classes that are called rhetoric, but we also do it in communication classes. I think you can view salesmanship as largely applied rhetoric,
Right. But like selling someone a car is different than like, I guess, people do go around and proselytize, but the direct proselytation is not usually the thing that's going to change someone's mind there. But obviously, rhetoric isn't dead. There's lots of applications, especially for the straightforward, just as you said. But for certain things that you can't go a direct approach, and you have to have maybe a circuitous route.
And I think that there are a lot of people. I mean, if you go on like Twitter or you go on Instagram or anything that's kind of visually oriented, you're going to see a lot of people talking about Aristotle's, three main modes of appeal, logos, ethos, pathos. But then when you look at what these people have to say about it, it's clear they all they've done is like copied it and pasted. They don't know what any of these things mean, or they can talk about it in a very vague sense, but they're not really master rhetoricians or theorists of rhetoric. And part of the problem is that Aristotle, okay, we're talking about more than 2,300 years ago. Why would we possibly think that like he exhausted the totality of ways in which we appeal to each other, right?
Right.
Or if we, add other people in, Cicero's great. He adds some new things to the picture, Quintilian. There's all sorts of great rhetoricians running all the way through to the 20th century. I mentioned last time that I'm a big fan of Chaim Perlman and Ulbricht's Tateka's A New Rhetoric, and that's much more comprehensive, but I'm sure there's stuff they forgot and left out, right?
Right.
So I think that when we say is traditional rhetoric dead, some people might take that as, does it cover everything that we could possibly want? And the answer is, well, why the hell would it? Right?
Right. So what are the other things? And some of these are, in-group thoughts. And as social creatures, we often believe things because it's required to be part of a group. If you want to be accepted by Packer fans, you have to like the Packers. If you want to be part of the Mormon Church, so you need to accept that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. These are kind of like really base ideas that if you don't believe these things, then you're like, well, then why are you here?
Yeah.
Go someplace else. And when we the flip side of that is that when we lose these beliefs, we also lose our membership to these groups. And we, as social creatures, are incredibly worried about the idea of being ostracized or removed from the group. We can lose family or friends. There are certain religions that will break all contact with you if you leave the group or leave that religion, and that's a really strong motivator for you to maintain those beliefs. And it's incredibly strong, like, motivated reasoning to, like, well, I believe this because otherwise I lose my mom and my dad, my sisters and brothers.
Yeah, I mean, and that can also happen in families even without, like, you could call it religious overlay interfering. Like if, I don't know, like take a situation of abuse or exploitation, or even just parents that didn't do a particularly good job. And like, the parents are very invested in, oh, we did the best that we could. And there's a couple kids who buy into it. And then one kid goes to therapy and they're like, holy crap, my family is messed up, right? And now I want to talk about it. They can sometimes find themselves being pushed out as a result. Nobody wants to engage in discourse with them, So right. I think that's that. And that can happen too, like in workplaces or, I mean, if you were working at Twitter right now and you're like, oh, this takeover was just amazing. It's just like blue skies ahead. I think your fellow workers are probably going to be like, are you getting paid for saying that?
Right. And then, another added bit to this whole thing is, the exile, especially for a portion of the human development, was synonymous with death. If you got kicked out of the group, especially in a terrible time, that was, a high likelihood you're going to die. So we have this really strong, ingrained, more than just like I feel bad because people left me, but like it's very close to that fear of death. So, there's also a number of other newer kind of like more comprehensive systems. I assume there's going to be even more as we continue learning on, but a couple of nice ones are a heuristic systematic model, but this is by Shelley Chakran and Alice E. Egley. And so people are motivated to hold correct attitudes, correct means and self-serving or group-serving reasons. Belief is based on reputation management. So a confidence gap exists between when you hear a new idea and a new idea actually coming and you accepting it by the ideal, by a heuristic of if their in-group peers will accept that belief.
Yeah.
So you're at the philosophy department and you got a new idea. Are your philosophy professors going to agree with you? How much extra work do you have to do to make sure that they would actually agree with your argument versus like, some random group of people on the street?
I think it's unfortunate to say, but philosophy departments are not the place to go to find the most rational human beings. I mean, I could see this, like, in terms of the fads that we have, or like this is the way that you do philosophy, and you're like, this isn't the only way to do philosophy. I can go down the street to another university with a different department, and they're going to be like more amenable to these ideas, or different authors, or different approaches, and how much we can like draw on psychology or economics or other fields, right? It's not as if there's like one single philosophy line, but you often do see this in departments where they're like, this is the way philosophy is done, And I think you see this too a lot in business, right? Where business people they've got one particular model of how they like to do business, and they think that this is the way a corporation should be structured, or this is how HR should work, or stuff like that. And they, if you disagree with them, you're going to have a hard time.
Right. So this comes to, eventually, asymmetric, what I'm calling asymmetric rhetoric, which are a number of techniques that have been developed in the last, 15 years for kind of going at trying to change people's minds from a less direct way, kind of circuitous way. And so these two...
Now, why is it asymmetric rhetoric? What's the asymmetry in it?
Because if you're expecting to have a conversation in the way that most rhetoric happens, you're just even having a dialogue, you're like, okay, I'm going to present my evidence, you're going to present your evidence, we're going to argue about the evidence, we might argue about premises or like structure of things, and this goes, nope, not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about something related but not the thing. So it's over here, and so asymmetric in that one person is expecting one thing from the conversation, and this is kind of a different way to go about the same end goal, but it's not the same.
Okay. That makes sense.
These two are deep canvassing and street epistemology.
So canvassing, when I hear that, I think about people going door to door.
That is exactly it.
Okay.
So most canvassing goes like, knock on the door. Are you going to vote for this person? Yes or no? And like, do you know it's election day? Yes or no? Great. Put the little check on your list and you go to the next door. Or there's like, hey, you should vote for, this person or this proposition. And that's kind of it.
Okay.
You might have a couple talking points. I've done canvassing. But deep canvassing is a strategy by which people try to engage their interlocutors, the people they're talking to, in open conversation and ask them their views. So it's not like, hey, you should do this. These are arguments to do this thing. This is, I want to have a conversation, and it turns this into a potential antagonistic relationship into, hey, I'm just another human being here. I want to know what you think.
Yeah.
And so it automatically changes the conversation from an argumentative position or an adversarial position into something that's more constructive.
Okay. So this could be done as actual canvassing, going and knocking on people's doors, right?
Right.
Have you ever gone to a death cafe? Where people walk in, and it's basically you have unstructured conversations. You walk in and there's tables. You sit down at a table, and then you talk about your views on death, And it's supposed to be fairly non-programmatic. You're not supposed to walk in there and be like, let me tell you about what I know about the afterlife, And, there's a good place and a bad place. You want to go to the good place? Well, you got to accept Jesus in your heart. None of that sort of stuff there, right? It's more like, well, what do you think? Then you can get into, well, why do you think that sort of thing? Mm-hmm. And, I've only been to one, but it was kind of cool. Once people find out that you're a philosopher, either they really want to talk to you or they don't want to talk to you at all. So it's kind of tough to do with that. I suppose it's like, if you're a lawyer and you walk into certain contexts, but it seems like the conversational approach would be similar to what deep canvassing looks like. So could that be an instance of deep canvassing?
Not exactly, because there's a couple more steps to it. So the first thing is you're asking them about their views, but it's about a particular topic. And so this started out with, I believe it was gay marriage was one of the first places where they started using this, and they're like, okay, go in and they're like, hey, tell me about your views about gay marriage. What do you think, positive or negative? And kind of why do you think this thing? And then you engage in active listening. And then you're going to share your personal experience to connect with their points of views. And so you want to listen, you want to repeat back what they say so they know that you're actually listening to them, that you're not just on a script. And a lot of times they started off this with people that were actually LGBT plus, in that and then there's I met my partner and we love each other just the way that you talk about, I guess it was talking about marriage, what do you think about marriage and whatnot.
Yeah.
And then they would say, they would make they would take their story and find the places that was similar between their story and the person that they're talking with and say oh, you're just like me. And so now they're already in this place where they're sharing their views and the things that they really like about this thing.
Yeah.
And they say, hey, well, why shouldn't I have that same exact thing? And then that's the third piece here, is to give perspective and highlight commonalities, and alternate viewpoints. And so they at first they thought they had to have someone that already had these life experiences to do these canvassing, but they've actually found that you can do this with people that don't have these experiences, but relate to people that they know, and it still does a very good way of process by which we can go and put it into a story that they can see in a non-threatening manner, in a way that also relates to them.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, that sounds like it could also involve some, traditional rhetoric or storytelling as well, right? So it's not like incompatible with older approaches. It's sort of like an add-on, or an overarching structure that you put it into.
Yeah, and so I guess just from if you're kind of making the rhetoric as this narrow, like I'm gonna have these arguments, kind of set up and whatnot. I'm gonna kind of debate you. These are very different, and this one as well as street epistemology both start with, making it so you're not an adversary. That we're here to have a enjoyable conversation, so walls don't go up. So the next
what do you do if you're in one of these formats and you get somebody who really wants to be an adversary? Like they've got old ideas about this, or they just get a kick out of I love to debate people, that one of those kind of people. Do you just say, well, we're not going to do that here? Or do you kick them out, or do you try to work with them?
Well, for deep canvassing, people are actually going door to door. So I'd say instead of kicking them out, you probably just leave if they're that adversarial.
You can't kick them out of their own house.
Yeah. But if you try to there are techniques to try to get people back on track. And say, hey, I'm trying to have a conversation with you. I want to know what you think. And try to get into that mode. It's that's the place where you actually get benefit.
Yeah, I suppose in that way you can say, listen, I value hearing from you. I do want to know what you think. And so you're bringing some incentive to them to play nice, so to speak.
Right. So speaking of that, now we have street epistemology, and this is actually the one that I'm most familiar with because I've used this a number of times. And so this is a way of talking about a thing as something you brought up earlier, epistemology. How do we know the things we know?
Yeah.
And so this is has a number of steps to it. So I'll just go to step one. So you have someone that you want to talk about something that they believe, and so you, as before, we establish rapport and informed consent. Hey, would you like to have a conversation? Hey, I'm really interested in what you believe and why. And most people are really willing to share the things that they believe, especially if that's something they strongly held. Most people want to share that. You want both the people to be happy and enjoy every part of the conversation. There's obviously, once again, non-adversarial, and so it's really important to set up good rapport.
How do you do that?
Be friendly, small talk, chit chat. Get to know the person a little bit before you even get into this. Hey, how you doing? You enjoying your day here? If you're at a grocery store, I don't know, you could say hey, what you picking up or something. I don't know. It depends on if you want to go out and engage someone, or if you want to have people come up to you and you could put up a sign. It's hey, I'm down for conversation. It's kind of like this death cafe thing. People are there for the conversations in the first place.
So it's not like the meme with the guy who sets up a table and then
change my view.
Says, well, it says it'll there'll be an assertion that he's change my mind, Yeah. It's not adversarial like that.
Right. No, it's very much I'm not even going to hold a belief. I just want to know about your beliefs.
Okay.
And we'll talk about your beliefs and things that you care about. And so then you try to identify the claim, and then we're going to find a confidence level. This is actually an optional approach, but this is useful if you're new to this. Excuse me, if you're new to this approach. That is this the thing that you're going to ask this again at the end of it of their confidence level, and to see if you did change their confidence in this belief in the first place. And once you have that confidence level, you kind of continue to ask about the claim itself and identify and clarify the main reasons. And so, we had to identify and clarify the claim because sometimes the claims are a little bit muddy, and then we had to then try to clarify the reasons, because these are also potentially muddy. So you want to find like the one that they're most strongly believe this thing for. And so we all have lots of reasons that we believe the things that we believe, and we want to find the epistemological reason why they do believe this thing. And so if you can kind of hone in on that thing, then we ask to identify and explore the epistemology. So we take this thing, why do they believe this? And so we look at the epistemological reason someone believes that thing. Do they believe other things for the same reason? Do those reasons always lead to true conclusions? Do other people use those same reasons and come to the opposite conclusions as yours? And so a lot of times people will have things that they might even be totally true, but they believe them for the wrong reasons because the reasoning is not sound. If you find one that has bad reasoning, you go like, oh, hey, let's talk about this. Why do other people believe other things, but they use the same reasoning? If that's not a good litmus test, then what are the other things that we can use to try to reason this and find a better reason to believe this thing? Because a lot of this is about trying to find true beliefs and what can one do to work through that. So if you find one that gets knocked down, you go back up to 4 and you find a new reason until either there's no more reasons or you find a good one that actually holds up to scrutiny. And then you end the conversation, or you can end it before they actually, go through all these. Most people don't change their mind about anything from a single conversation.
Yeah.
There's not a lot.
But you're planting seeds, right? You're priming them for changing their minds down the line.
Right. And I think just people should have better epistemologies for the things that they believe anyways. Like, I want to believe true things, and I would like other people to do. But you want to end the conversation on a really friendly note. The whole idea here is that we're supposed to be both enjoying this so that we're not being antagonistic. The idea is not to win the argument, make the other person feel bad, but to try to hopefully people have better reasons for the things that they believe. You might find that these conversations also can change your own mind. Because maybe you were believing things for bad reasons as well, and they bring up those same things.
I like the idea in there about the conversation is supposed to be enjoyable or pleasant or engaging, right?
Yeah.
Because I've heard people, talk about street epistemology in the past, and I've never really paid attention to it. Because what I pictured were guys going around and debating with each other and trying to one up each other, stuff like that. But this sounds completely different.
Yeah.
This sounds like it actually could be something fun. It's collaborative, right?
Yes. And I've seen people do interesting things with UFOs or flat Earth or I should be a Democrat or I should be a Republican. All these ideas that we hold, or that whatever budget. You could be mundane things I think we should spend more money on X or Y. All these things can be investigated with this particular tool, and then you can have post-conversation stuff you can say, hey, do you want to have this conversation again or something, because once again, as you said, it usually takes a number of conversations to actually get there.
And maybe bring in additional stuff, right, in a new conversation, or you remember things that you should have talked about before. We've all had that experience of I should have said this, right?
Yeah.
Now, I think we better wrap up because we're pretty close to the end of the hour. Do you want to take us out on a final thought?
Yeah. So, we leave you with the words of Lee McIntyre. You don't convince someone who doesn't base their beliefs on evidence by providing them with more evidence.